Recorded.
Okay, got it. Welcome everybody to this month's Climate Action Network webinar, a project of Climate Action Santa Monica, which we call CASM. I'm Kent Strumpel, co-chair of our steering committee. We have an important guest lined up for today, Dana Nuccitelli, research coordinator for Citizens Climate Lobby. He's going to give us a presentation, which will be followed by a Q&A, answering questions submitted by all of you. Note that you can begin putting questions in the chat at any time. First, though, Lorraine Von Clan, the other co-chair of our steering committee, is going to give us a few updates on activities at CASM. Lorraine?
Yes, thank you, Kent. So for those of you who don't know, Climate Action Santa Monica is focused on transformative local climate action. What that means is that we want to accomplish things that will have lasting systemic impact and lead to a climate-friendly future. So the things that we're working on right now are getting all of our local energy users to be at 100% renewable energy. In households are doing fabulously with that. Everybody's doing it. But we don't have our large energy users on board yet. Santa Monica Malibu School District is going to be moving to 100% clean renewable energy soon, but there are other people who are other large energy users, businesses, college, hospitals, etc., that are not. So we want to bring them to 100% renewable. We're also trying to put policies and projects in place that lead to both near-term and long-term climate-friendly future for Santa Monica. And example of that would be making sure our mobility system is built out fully so that it can really accommodate all kinds of zero emissions mobility. Third is what we're doing today. We are engaging the community, and we do that through peer-to-peer events where people can hear from neighbors about what they're doing. But we also have fun events like our King Tides Citizen Science Project that will be happening in February, bicycle ride by the bay, but also our youth program where we seek to empower youth to become leaders in this climate movement and give them a head start on learning about the really complex issues. And I'm delighted to say that Jasmine Contreras, one of our climate fellows, is here with us today, just waved to say hello. We're building a strong, finally, we're trying to build a strong local climate organization. That means we want to get beyond the volunteer stage to have a staff to really empower the volunteers and to have really deep impact. So Climate Action Santa Monica is hoping that you will support us. I'm going to put a link in the chat. We really do need to raise money to build this organization, and I hope that you can assist us in doing that. Thank you. Kent? Oh, I'm going to turn it over to Gerda now. Gerda. You're on. Yeah, you need to unmute, Gerda. Are you unmuted?
No, I'm not. I was doing 3 things at once.
Okay, I unmuted you. We're good.
I think I'm set now. Hi, everybody. My name is Gerda Newbold. For those of you who don't know me, I am the co-chair of the West LA chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. And our areas cover Santa Monica, West LA, Culver City, Palisades, the general west side of LA County. I thought I was going to be moving my slide, but it's not. Oh, there we are. I'm going to give you a brief overview of who Citizens Climate Lobby is, because not everybody on this call is familiar with us. We are nonpartisan, grassroots, volunteer citizen lobbyists. We advocate for national legislation to address climate change. We have over 400 chapters across the US, and we actually have chapters abroad also. The photo that you're seeing is from our annual June Lobby Day in Washington, D.C. this past June, where volunteers from all over the country go to Capitol Hill, and we spend a day lobbying both Republicans and Democrats and senators and congresspeople on specific bills and climate change legislation in general. And this year we spent a lot of time talking to them about permitting reform. Our areas of focus, we have 4 of them. The first one is carbon pricing with a cash back to US households. That is something that CCL has been working on since our founding in 2007. Recently, we've broadened our agenda, and so we are also looking at clean energy permitting reform, healthy forests, or I like the term natural climate solutions, since we don't have a lot of forests here in Southern California. And then, of course, building electrification and efficiency. This is a picture of us this past June with Ted Lieu's office, actually talking about permitting reform. Dana Nuccitelli is an environmental scientist, a journalist, and is currently the research coordinator for CCL. He has written about climate change for a variety of publications, including The Guardian and the Yale Climate Connections. He's been a longtime advocate for national policies to address climate change. He was a volunteer for a long time at CCL, but he's an actual employee since 2021, I think, Dana. And we really appreciate him being here today. Dana?
Thanks, Gerda. Can you unshare yours so I can share mine?
I can. I think I can.
Okay. Let me get mine going. Okay. There we go. Okay, so yeah, Gerda already introduced me, research coordinator for CCL, environmental scientist, and climate journalist. Currently mostly writing for Yale Climate Connections. And Gerda did a nice job introducing CCL, nonprofit climate advocacy group, chapters in just about every congressional district around the country. Our main thing we do is train and empower our volunteers to lobby their representatives, which we do in June, in-person lobbying in DC, and then also a November virtual lobbying, our main lobbying events. And the November one is coming up in just a couple weeks. And Gerda talked about our 4 policy areas, and I'm going to be focusing on permitting reform. So let's just do a real quick basics on what permitting is. That's when you get your authorization from the government, be it a local or state or federal government, to begin the construction of a project. Permits are very important because you want to make sure you're protecting communities and workers and environments from undue harm from the construction and operation of the project. By getting permits, it takes time, it takes money, and so it can delay projects quite a bit. And so you want to strike the right balance where you're doing good, effective permitting, making sure you protect the environment and the community and the workers, but not taking so long that you're delaying the project for a long time, especially when we're trying to make this transition to a clean energy economy that we're trying to make happen relatively fast. And so you don't want permitting to slow that down too much. So that's why we're doing permitting reform, because right now we feel like the permitting process is just taking too long. And so we want to find that sweet spot where it's not taking too long, but it's still doing the job. And so the goals that we're trying to achieve with permitting reform, I mean, basically we're looking to streamline the permitting process, make it go more efficiently. Critically, we're not just trying to green light every project, but we're just trying to get to that final approval or denial of the permit, the ultimate yes or no decision, in a more expedient manner. That's because we're trying to build all this clean infrastructure faster, which, especially when it comes to transmission lines, which I'll talk about, building those faster would improve the reliability, security, and affordability of our energy and of our power grid. So lots of different benefits if we can get this accomplished. And then also during the process of permitting reform, we're trying to bolster community involvement in the permitting process, which I'll also talk more about here in a few minutes. But first, I'm going to talk about improving the power grid because that's really the key bottleneck when it comes to making this transition to a clean energy economy because we've got lots of good incentives now to build lots of solar power and wind power. Those technologies have become really cheap. They're the cheapest sources of new electricity in the United States right now. And then we got these tax credits passed in the Inflation Reduction Act. So now there's kind of financial certainty for project developers. And so we're ready to build a whole bunch of clean energy, but you have to have wires to connect that clean energy to the grid, especially because we tend to build big solar farms and wind farms out. You have to build them where there's affordable available land out in rural areas, but you're trying to get that electricity mainly to population centers. And so you need to connect those two with transmission lines. But that process of permitting transmission lines is very, very slow. And then another issue we face is that we're seeing a lot more of these extreme weather events, these heat waves, heat domes, polar vortexes, floods, hurricanes, things that tend to knock out power generation. And often that happens at the same time as there's like increased demand for electricity because it's really hot or really cold. And so people need to cool or heat their homes. And so you get this mismatch of reduced supply and increased demand, and that can create blackouts and really dangerous conditions that we want to avoid. So one thing you can do to help avoid that is to add more transmission capacity between different regions of the country so that a neighboring region that's outside of the extreme weather event can send some of its extra electricity to the region that's being hit by the extreme weather event so they can help avoid some of those blackouts with that surplus electricity being sent to the neighbors. So there's one bill called the Big Wires Act. I'm actually doing a specific training about that tonight at 5 o'clock for CCL. But basically the bill says each region of the country has to be able to import a certain amount of electricity from its neighbors to help develop these lines to make sure that we have better grid security and avoid those blackouts. That bill doesn't really do anything to speed up the rate at which we permit transmission lines. So another thing we can do is, really the thing that slows down these really long, big transmission lines is having to get a permit in each individual state and locality that the transmission line is going to go through, which ends up being a whole lot of paperwork. And so a more efficient way to do that would just have one central agency, which would be the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, be like the one-stop shop for the permitting of this big transmission line, and FERC would consult with the individual states and localities that the line would go through, but they would do all the permitting in-house. That is currently how we do the permitting for interstate natural gas pipelines, and that permitting process takes about half as long as the permitting of interstate electric transmission lines right now. So we basically want to treat at least the big important transmission lines in the same way as we permit these natural gas pipelines and speed things up. So we're hoping to get something like that in the permitting reform deal. Another issue is that there's often stumbling blocks when we're trying to figure out who's going to pay for how much of a transmission line because nobody wants to pay for it. And so a good way to do that is just to have like a set formula established by something like an organization like FERC that says like you pay proportional to how much you benefit, and there's a formula that determines how much you benefit and how much you pay, just to make it simple, straightforward, and avoid those arguments. And then because the power grid is this big national complicated thing that we're trying to make more secure and more stable, which takes a lot of planning. There's also been proposals to create a dedicated office of transmission within FERC to work on some of that long-term, large-scale planning that's kind of challenging to do. So some examples, and one that affects you guys directly, of these long-distance interstate transmission lines. There's one called Transwest Express that just got approved. It took about 16 years to get it permitted, and the idea is that there's a wind developer in Wyoming who's got all this wind potential and wanted to build a big wind farm and send that electricity all the way over down here to Nevada, Southern California, and Arizona. And you can see that transmission line goes through 4 different states, and so they had to get the permits from all the different states and localities that it was going through, and so it took a really long time, and so now we're finally going to start getting it built and eventually get some of that clean electricity into Southern California. But if we could have gotten it permitted in a more efficient manner, then like it might have already been built. We might have already been benefiting from that nice, clean, cheap electricity coming from Wyoming. And just a couple more examples. There's one called Sunzia in Southwest. It's planning to take wind energy from New Mexico and take it over to Arizona, which is not as long as that Trans-West Express line, but it still took about 14 years to permit that one. And just recently, there was also the Grain Belt Express transporting electricity between these 4 states, Indiana to Kansas. Again, that one took 13 years to permit because Missouri was kind of the last holdout on that one and just finally recently approved that the permitting to go through their state. So yeah, we could really streamline this process and still get to the same results, just make it go faster. So I mentioned why this is important because we're about to see this hopefully explosion in solar and wind projects. Again, they're going to be located out mostly in rural areas, and so you need those transmission lines to connect those solar farms and wind farms to mainly cities and towns. But they're taking, on average, they take a decade to build, and as we saw, those really big ones, they go through multiple different states, can take well over a decade to permit and build those big transmission lines. And those are the things that are really holding up our transition to a clean energy economy. And this is something that a lot of experts have been talking about. There was just this report from the International Energy Agency. It was actually the subject of my newest Yale Climate Connections article. So this is a report where they're putting together a net zero roadmap. So they're looking at the progress we've made so far in decarbonizing the economy and what it will take to get to net zero by 2050 globally, to keep the 1.5 degrees ambitious Paris climate target within reach. And one of the things they said was that for all countries, speeding up permitting, extending and modernizing electricity grids, addressing supply chain bottlenecks, and securely integrating variable renewables are critical. Building grids today can take more than a decade, with permitting a particularly time-consuming bottleneck. So it's a problem in a lot of countries. Europe has had a lot of slow permitting too, although they've taken some steps recently to try to make their permitting process more efficient. And so that's also what we're trying to do in the United States. And just a couple of days ago, the National Academies of Science also published a report on how we're going to accelerate decarbonization in the United States. And they said a lot of similar things. Perhaps the single greatest risk to a successful energy transition in the 2020s is the risk that the nation fails to site, modernize, and build out the electric grid. The need for adding new transmission capacity and pathways in the 2020s is unprecedented. The net result could be increased use of fossil fuels. That's because we're doing all these things to electrify our economies. We're getting more electric cars, electric heat pumps, electric stoves, all these electric things that increase the demand for electricity. And so if you're not connecting all this new solar and wind to the grid with these transmission lines, then instead you're going to have to meet that increased electricity demand with fossil fuels. And then that becomes counterproductive. Then you're actually increasing your fossil fuel consumption instead of decreasing it. So that's why transmission is so important. And then the committee for the National Academies of Science recommended setting in permitting reforms as well. And there was this important analysis by these energy modelers at Princeton called the Princeton Repeat Project that looked at, as soon as the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, they looked at what would happen if we don't speed up the rate at which we're building out our electrical transmission infrastructure. And they found that if we don't speed it up, we'll only achieve about 20% of the potential climate pollution reductions from the Inflation Reduction Act. And I'll show that in this chart, which what we're looking at is the amount of wind and solar power generation capacity added in the United States since 2010 up through what's projected this year. So you can see wind and solar have been growing. We would like them to grow faster, but they've been growing at a decent clip so far. And so the Princeton modeler said, if we continue building out our electrical transmission infrastructure at the rate we have been over the past decade or two, which is increasing it at 1% per year, the capacity of our electrical transmission infrastructure, then the wind and solar power generation that we're going to add looks like this purple line, which is not a whole lot faster than we have added it in the past. A little bit faster thanks to these tax credits, but not a whole lot faster. But if we can build out our transmission a bit faster at 1.5% per year, then it becomes this yellow line. Then you start to see a much more rapid growth in, especially in solar, but also wind electricity capacity additions. And if we can get up to 2% transmission expansion per year, then you really you open up a lot more capacity for us to add all of this solar and wind that's just waiting to be built with these tax credits and these cheap prices ready to be built if we could just have the transmission capacity available to connect it to the grid. So you can see a very big difference depending on how quickly we can get these transmission lines permitted and built. And then I mentioned the importance of early community involvement. That's because, I mean, obviously, if you're having an energy infrastructure project built in your community, you want to make sure that you can provide your input and have your voice heard in the permitting and construction of that project. And then the benefit of that is that you're not excluding anybody, because when we're streamlining the permitting process, we don't want to do it at the cost of excluding people from having their input heard in the permitting of projects. And when people's voices are excluded, then they're more likely to be upset about the outcome of the project and to bring a lawsuit. And lawsuits, as we know, can take years and years and really extend the timelines of these projects. And so we want to avoid lawsuits as often as possible. And so involving the community early in the permitting process really has this win-win of making sure everybody gets their input and their voices heard, and also avoiding these really time-consuming lawsuits down the line, and thus making the permitting process overall more efficient and timely. So there are some specific proposals how we can do that and improve early community involvement. For example, we can have federal agencies that work on permitting identify a chief community engagement officer to work on community involvement, and also provide those federal agencies with funds specifically to work on community engagement so they have the resources needed. We could also allow agencies to require community benefits agreements, which is an agreement between a project developer and the local community to do something that will benefit the community, so it's kind of worthwhile for the community to approve of the project. For example, hiring a certain number of local residents in the project, for example. We can also just tell agencies you have to provide meaningful public involvement opportunities in the permitting process. And we can provide support for what are called pre-development programs for these projects, which can include things like providing grants to communities so that they have the resources to get involved in the permitting process. Then there are what we call NEPA reforms, which are reforms to the National Environmental Policy Act, which is the main law, not the only environmental law, but it's the main environmental law that governs permitting on federal lands. Most of these already passed in the debt ceiling deal, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, but they include things like when there's multiple agencies working on the permitting of a given project, designating one lead agency that makes the ultimate decisions, and then the other agencies provide just input to that agency. So you just have one agency like in charge. Also having those agencies work together on a single environmental document rather than each agency doing its own document and duplicating efforts. That makes it much more efficient. The bill passed also set time and page limits on environmental assessments and environmental impact reports. It allowed for project applicants, or more likely their contractors, to draft those environmental assessment and impact reports. But then the federal agencies have to review those documents and take responsibility for their accuracy. So it takes the workload off of the federal agencies having to write all of these environmental documents, but they still have to review them, make comments, make sure that they're accurate. And then the bill also started creating an online permitting portal, which creates transparency so we can see where in the permitting process a given project is. One thing that wasn't included, but would be probably a good thing to add, was that when agencies disagree about something in a permitting of a project, there's currently no process for them to resolve that. There's no set established process. And so we can do something as simple as just saying, if you have a disagreement, you have 30 days to get together in a meeting, come together, find a resolution, and then you have another 30 days to issue that resolution to the project developer. And then another issue is the statute of limitations on NEPA lawsuits, because currently once a NEPA permit is granted, then there's a 6-year window during which a lawsuit can still be brought, which creates a lot of uncertainty for project developers, as they have this kind of threat hanging over their heads of a lawsuit being able to come at any time. So there's been various proposals to shorten that to anywhere between 2 months and 3 years. So there's a deal to be had in there somewhere. It's important not to shorten it too much, because then if an organization is considering bringing a lawsuit and they're running up against the clock where the statute of limitations is about to run out, then it kind of forces their hand and forces them to bring a lawsuit. Whereas if they had some more time, then they might decide that a lawsuit wouldn't be fruitful and wouldn't bring the lawsuit. So you have to find the sweet spot where you're giving organizations and individuals enough time to consider whether they need to bring a lawsuit, but not creating so much time that it's too much uncertainty for project developers. And so Congress will be trying to find that sweet spot. And then some other proposed permitting reforms. There is an existing program called Fast 41, which is basically an interagency council that for important and large energy infrastructure projects gives them a high level expedited review. It seems to work very well. And so there have been some proposals to expand it. Like, for example, currently a project has to have $200 million worth of investments to qualify. And there's been a proposal to lower that to $50 million in investments, so some somewhat smaller projects can qualify for Fast 41. Another good idea would be to have federal agencies look at maps of the country that show sensitive areas of environmental and other sensitivity, find where there are gaps, where there would be a low sensitivity, and designate those as kind of good low impact go-to areas to build infrastructure projects, and then give those areas a more expedited permitting process because they've already been identified as low sensitivity. We could also consider more of the co-benefits of projects, like if you're proposing a transmission line, you can consider that that's going to make the grid more stable. It's going to avoid more blackouts. It's probably going to allow more wind and solar to be built, which is going to reduce climate pollution and other air pollution, and then it's going to have health benefits. So the more of these co-benefits you consider, the more likely the project is to be approved. And then if there's been an environmental review of a project done before the NEPA process, you could then allow the reuse of that environmental assessment during the NEPA process, as long as the project and the site haven't changed significantly in the meantime, just to avoid duplicative efforts. And then geothermal power is interesting because it's potentially a significant source of firm, clean power. We have a lot of heat underneath our feet that we could be using for stable electricity, but the permitting of geothermal drilling is currently very, very slow, whereas the permitting of oil and gas drilling is very, very fast because oil and gas has gotten some exemptions because they're an influential or industry. And so we could just apply those same exemptions that oil and gas drilling has gotten to geothermal drilling, which is probably lower environmental impact anyway, and then get more geothermal drilling happening faster. We could also do regular federal land lease sales of just specifically for geothermal projects, because there's a lot of potential geothermal energy under federal lands right now, especially in the West. And then we're going to need a lot of critical minerals to build all this clean energy infrastructure, things like solar panels and wind turbines and batteries. And it'll be great if we get more of those materials from the United States, where we have good environmental and worker safety regulations. So if we can improve our domestic mineral exploration and development permitting, that would also be very good. So I think I will stop there. But I should say that that's kind of the federal level. There is also, of course, local level permitting that's important when there's projects proposed in your local area, and there's often opposition for often bad reasons to clean energy projects. And so it's always good when the local city council or the Public Utility Commission or whoever it is that's considering the project hears from supporters, so that then they're not only hearing from voices that are opposing these important clean energy projects. But CCL, we're focused on the national level though. So anyway, I will stop there and happy to take any questions. See a lot of questions.
Yeah, there's several questions in the chat already. You can take a look at them too. Dana, if you want. Um,
Yeah, Kent, why don't you go through them and read them? And
yeah, I'll field them to you.
great.
So uh, from Sam Contreras, how do you define the sweet spot where permitting does not take too long while still ensuring the public interest is protected? You may have covered that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I talked about there is a sweet spot, and I mean, how to identify that, I think, is when you're, as I said, you're improving the community involvement in the permitting process. So, like, the bad way to do it would be to cut people out of the process in order to streamline it. I think the good way to do it is actually to engage the community more while basically making it so that, federal agencies can work in a more efficient manner. Like some of the things that were passed in the debt ceiling deal are pretty good at least helping federal agencies just avoid duplicative work and just work more efficiently. So those things are helpful. And again, for transmission lines, like if we could have just this one-stop shop for permitting of interstate transmission lines instead of having to do permits in every single state and locality. So just doing things like that where you're not cutting corners, but you're just finding ways to do the permitting process like as effectively as it has been, but just doing it more efficiently. That's kind of the right way to do permitting reform. So we just have to make sure that we're doing it carefully, that we're not cutting people out, not cutting corners, not making it a less like a less thorough permitting process, so that like we're not risking like more environmental damage being done, but we're just doing it like so the same permitting process is done more efficiently, basically.
Okay. Laureen is asking who's for and who's against this. I guess referring to permit reform in general.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. Everybody is for some kinds of permitting reform. And so the key is to find a bipartisan compromise where everybody gets some of the stuff they want and they get some of the stuff they're not too interested in, but they don't get anything that they're like so opposed to that they will oppose the permitting reform. So there are different groups, like for example, I mentioned the giving the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that interstate permitting authority. Republicans tend not to like that because you're transferring authority from states to the federal government, and they're federalists. They like keeping authority within the states. Also, monopoly utilities and locally in charge of their local transmission lines are very opposed to transferring that permitting authority to FERC because they want to be in charge of their own transmission as much as possible, and they have the ear of certain members of Congress. So we're not sure if that particular piece can get in a permitting reform bill, but we're going to try to get it in there, but that tends to be opposed by Republicans. A lot of environmental justice groups are very concerned about permitting reform because, again, they're concerned about cutting out people's voices. And a lot of the tools that environmental justice groups tend to use is like this, they tend to use a slow permitting process. Like if they see like there's a natural gas pipeline that they don't want to be approved, they will try to gum up the works and bring lawsuits and do challenges to those particular projects to try to stop them. But if you make the permitting process more efficient, then it becomes harder to gum up the works for those particular projects. And so there are aspects of permitting reform that environmental justice groups like making it easier to build clean energy and transmission lines, but they don't like the aspects that will also make it easier to build things like gas pipelines and other fossil fuel infrastructure. And my response to that is that, like when you do permitting reform in general, the main thing that benefits is clean energy because like that's what the demand is for right now. That's the solar and wind is the cheapest sources of electricity right now, and that's like if you look at what's in the queue, what's waiting to be built, it's like 90% plus clean energy and then some gas pipelines and some gas infrastructure, but not a whole lot. Like most of the demand is for wind and solar. And also from an environmental justice perspective, like there's a lot of existing fossil fuel infrastructure that is polluting the air and the water in communities located near those, for example, coal power plants. And so the faster you can build clean energy and get those dirty power plants and other dirty infrastructure replaced, then the better that is for those communities that are currently stuck breathing that air pollution. So there's actually an environmental justice angle from getting permitting reform, as long as it's done right, getting permitting reform done so that we can build this clean energy infrastructure faster and get rid of the existing dirty energy infrastructure. But yeah, I mean, any proposal that's like going to go into a permitting reform package, there's going to be people who like it and people who don't like it. And so there's like just everybody's got different reasons and different priorities that they're trying to get in an overall package. And it's just a matter of finding that package that everybody can kind of get enough of what they like that they'll vote in favor of it and support it.
Great. Okay, thank you. On this next one, right after you showed the 3 maps of proposed lines, Lorraine asked if there is any kind of map that would show where these lines would be proposed or would go. And so is there a overall map that kind of shows a wide national layout of what's being talked about?
I mean, there are maps of like existing infrastructure for sure. Like if you look at like there's like maps of existing natural gas pipeline infrastructures and just lines everywhere. It's kind of crazy. And then like if there's a specific project being proposed, then like there's always a map of that particular project and where it is going to be built. There's not like a map of like here is every single project that has been proposed and where it would be built, but there's like each individual project has its own map.
All right. All right. Another question here. I've heard that we will need offshore wind. If that is built off California's coast, will we need a transmission line somewhere out here?
Yeah, so we've got a lot of offshore wind potential off the coast of California and Oregon and Washington, but California's got a lot of potential. We've got some challenges there that we have like a very deep ocean floor off our coast, and so you have to do like floating wind turbines. You can't anchor it to ocean floor as easily because the ocean's so deep. And floating wind turbines there's a few of them installed around the world, but they're relatively new technology. And so we got a lot of potential in California to develop some cool floating wind turbine offshore infrastructure. And yeah, each offshore wind turbine farm or whatever you want to call it has to have its own transmission lines where it kind of goes along the sea floor and then comes up to connect to our transmission infrastructure on the land. But yeah, those particular lines are just like they kind of go along the floor of the ocean until they get to the shoreline.
And so presumably those would be for local service, or would there be transmission lines to send it out of state from there?
I mean, those transmission lines coming from the offshore wind to the shore would just connect to our existing transmission lines, and then those transmission lines would send them. So just those offshore lines would connect to existing transmission infrastructure and kind of send it to wherever those transmission lines go.
Okay, great.
That's where you connect it to.
Got it. All right. What impact does the recent legislation, including the Infrastructure and Inflation Reduction Act, have on the rate and extent of updating the national electric transmission grid?
Yeah, so like the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was passed about 2 years ago, it had some good funding for electrical transmission infrastructure. Again, the challenge is actually getting those things permitted, but some of those funds have been allocated to transmission lines, and like actually getting funding for transmission lines is also always important. And it had some regulatory changes too to try to make it a little bit easier to get these projects authorized, although that hasn't been super successful yet, which is why we're trying to still get further legal permitting changes in the permitting reform package. But at least it did have some important funding for that kind of electrical transmission infrastructure. So that was somewhat helpful.
Okay. Thank you. Sam asks, what does the potential look like for oil companies to sweep in on renewable energy and corner the market as they have, say, for gasoline for cars?
I mean, I wish they were more interested in doing that. We keep hearing stories of like some oil and gas company will say, oh, we're going to do some big investments in renewable energy. And then the latest news was like they're cutting back on their investments in renewable energy. I think the greatest potential there I mentioned is geothermal power, because like to do geothermal, like you have to drill deep into the underground and then like fracture some rocks, and so you can pass the water through the rocks and get the heat from the rocks into the water. And we can now have the technology to do that because we developed it during the fracking boom. And so like oil and gas industries, they have the expertise that they need to do this really deep drilling and fracking, and like do it for something better for the environment than they have been. And so there is a lot of interest among oil and gas industries to get involved in geothermal power. And I think all the big oil and gas majors now have geothermal departments in their organizations. And so they're kind of getting into it. And like, actually, that's one reason that there's been permitting reforms proposed for geothermal. Those are mostly proposed by Republican legislators, because the oil and gas industries are like, hey, we want to do some geothermal. Can you get us some permitting reforms so we can do more exploration into that? So I think that would be great if we get some oil and gas industries actually doing some clean energy and developing geothermal, which it's currently a little expensive. And so like the more development we could get of that source of clean energy and like a firm clean source of energy would be great. I don't know if the oil and gas industry will be able to necessarily corner the market, because there's also other small companies that are kind of already ahead of them in terms of developing geothermal power. But like, I would love to see oil and gas industries like do some clean energy and develop geothermal power further. But in terms of other renewable energies, they haven't shown very much interest so far. And there's a lot of other companies that are way ahead of them on that.
Okay, thank you. Question about job creation. Is the transmission line building also a jobs creation initiative? How and what does our workforce need to learn so that we have a great pipeline for employees?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we need to build a lot more transmission lines, and like there are existing utilities that have the know-how how to do that, or just to upgrade existing transmission lines so that they have more capacity to transport electricity. We have technologies to do that too. So I imagine, yeah, going into like electrical engineering could be helpful. Or just, I don't know, I've talked to a local utility or find out like what is the proper training and education needed to get those jobs. But I imagine like, since we are going to be building a lot more transmission, there should be a significant number of jobs there. If you're interested in clean energy jobs, a huge one is going to be electricians, because we're also doing all this electrification of our homes with heat pumps and heat pump water heaters and electric stoves. And you guys, before the call began, we're talking about like upgrading our electrical panels, which a lot of homes are going to need to do. And so like there's a concern that there's going to be a shortage of electricians. Like we need like 1 million more electricians in the very near term. And so that's a great career for people to go into if they're interested in clean energy, would be to become an electrician. Then you have job security forever, because everybody's going to be electrifying their homes for decades and decades to come.
Hey, great. Yeah, sounds like a good area to get into. Phil has a comment, maybe you could respond to it. If you let the applicants write the environmental documents, then the reviewing agencies may lose their budgets for the technical experts that they would still need to review the environmental documents.
Yeah, I mean, the federal agency budgets are set by Congress, and Congress is always messing around with those regardless of what the federal agency's requirements are. Like, I mean, oftentimes, like, you know, the previous 4 years, all the agency budgets were cut and they had to freeze hiring and lay people off. And even though like their job loads weren't decreased, like, so, you know, Congress's funding doesn't really have a lot to do with, unfortunately, like what the agencies actually need a lot of the time. But we also, in the Inflation Reduction Act, we did get, I think it was $1 billion directed to federal agencies so that they could hire and have more resources specifically for permitting, which from what I hear, it's like that'll kind of get them back up to where they were before the previous administration's cuts. But yeah, so that is definitely kind of a separate issue, is like making sure that the federal agencies have the necessary funding and resources to do their permitting reviews that they're going to need to do. But I wouldn't worry that like if we, you know, give more of the load of writing these assessments to project applicants, that Congress will be like, oh, they don't need the money anymore. Because I mean, you know, depending on your member of Congress, they're always saying federal agencies need less money or they need more money, and the reality of what they actually need often doesn't really play a role into that decision.
Well, yeah, and like for real estate development, it's common practice for the developer to pay for the EIR creation, and then it gets reviewed, you know, so presumably there's a good oversight that they're doing a good job on that. So
exactly,
it seems like a potentially workable model. Lorraine says, I hope we can achieve the best case scenario, but if we do not, is there some recommendation for projects to reduce consumption or increase local distributed energy resources to fill the gap? And if so, is anyone working on that?
Yeah, so this like federal congressional permitting reform is like it's important, but it's like only one piece of the puzzle, and there are all these other pieces. Like we certainly need to do as much distributed local energy, like rooftop solar, parking lot solar, as we can, because that's kind of in the place where it needs to be to produce the electricity. So you don't need the big long transmission lines. So that's helpful. I mean, the only downside with distributed energy like that is it's more expensive because it's less cost effective than putting a whole bunch of solar panels in, just installing them all at one time in one spot, as opposed to like putting a few on this roof and a few on this other roof and a few on this other roof. So utility scale solar is much more cost effective, but we're going to need to do both. We're going to need both utility scale solar and distributed solar. And there's also things we can do, like I mentioned, improving our existing transmission infrastructure and distribution infrastructure. Because like we built our infrastructure, our existing transmission lines, and we send electricity through them very conservatively to make sure like they don't like collapse and cause fires and things like that. And so we tend to send the amount of electricity through them that's just like the lowest amount. It's a very conservative amount, basically, because it's you're kind of assuming the worst conditions, like a very hot and windy day, whereas most days are not very hot and windy. But when you put in kind of monitoring systems, they're called dynamic line ratings, is like technologies that can monitor the existing conditions, like the current conditions, and say, oh, it's actually a very nice calm day, and so we could send much more electricity through this line right now. So just doing things like that can improve the amount of electricity you're transmitting without having to do like a whole bunch of big upgrades. So there's a lot of different things like that we can do. I mentioned local permitting is important too. So, and also FERC is actually doing a lot of important rulemakings to use what they have in their existing authority to try to speed up permitting processes. So yeah, I mean, when we talk about permitting reform and upgrading infrastructure writ large, there is a lot more to it than just congressional permitting reform, but congressional permitting reform is like one really important piece. But if we can't get it done, like we're going to certainly keep doing all those other things too.
Okay, and yeah, there looks like there's a follow-up on that. If local permitting is part of CCL's effort here.
I mean, it's not something that we focus on nationally with our national staff, because we have a limited staff and limited resources, and so we focus on national legislation. But certainly, we encourage local chapters. Like if you guys see like I mentioned, like if you see if there's like a local solar farm that's trying to get built and trying to get permitted, and there's going to be a hearing about it, like we would encourage you to local CCLers to go to that hearing and express your support, because there's certainly very likely going to be voices opposing it for usually bad reasons. And so yeah, things like that locally are kind of, we leave those up to the local CCL chapter, and local CCL chapters can determine like what's best for them to do locally. But the national staff, we focus mostly on federal legislation.
Okay. And Aaron from the Sierra Club asks, this is a complex one here. The community input piece has unfortunately been weaponized by people with means. What fundamentally changes when it comes to the community input piece? How is the playing field leveled between attorney-armed landowners and low-income communities at the fringe?
Yeah, so you go back to and think about the slide that I put up. That was the examples of the things we can do in permitting reform to improve early community involvement. It was things like having the federal agencies have a specific community involvement, like chief officer, and giving them the funds so that the federal agency is then, they have resources to themselves engage the community and make sure the community is getting engaged in the permitting process. Since like, yes, there is going to be like the project developer is probably going to have a lawyer and have resources, but you want to make sure that the community has the resources or the helping hand to get involved. And also there was the example of like sending grants to communities so that they have the resources to, like, they could potentially hire their own lawyers or get other experts involved. So yeah, it's a matter of getting those resources to federal agencies and communities so that they can then kind of have a similar level of resources available to get involved in the permitting process as for example, project developers are already going to have.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that may have also been looking at, a strategic way for a special interest group who doesn't want to see this for whatever interest they have, weaponizing it. Well, I guess you sort of spoke to that too. Just right.
Yeah,
Let's
it's
look.
basically the same answer. It's giving more people the resources to get involved in the permitting process. Like if
Right.
also want you to support it, people are going to support it to be able to get involved in the process too.
Mhm.
If it's a clean energy project.
Hey, what are the chances of getting bipartisan support for permitting reform? Of course, that's always a CCL goal.
Yes, now that's one of the main reasons that we're working on permitting reform. Is it's very important and it has bipartisan potential. So it's looking like a pretty good chances that we can get a bipartisan package put together. There's lots of members of Congress who are interested in it. Lots of the stuff I presented today, I actually presented to the Climate Solutions Caucus staffers, which is Climate Solutions Caucus is a group of 31 Republicans and 31 Democrats in the House of Representatives who are interested in finding bipartisan climate solutions. And like their first meeting, they're interested in permitting reform. So they had us come and present to them on permitting reform. So they're interested in it. Basically, it's kind of the area where everybody in Congress recognizes there's potential for a bipartisan climate solution. Both Republicans and Democrats. There are Republicans and Democrats in the Senate trying to work out a deal. Senator Manchin has been working on it since last year, and he is currently working on it with some various colleagues. So I think there's pretty good chances of some sort of compromise being reached. And then they have to try to figure out where they're going to put it. First, we have to get a functional House of Representatives, which that's the slow process right now. But until the House of Representatives is up and running, then nothing can happen. But hopefully that will happen relatively soon. And then hopefully, I'm guessing a deal will probably come out of the Senate because they've got some senators who are very interested and very active in working on it. And then they'll have to negotiate it with the House and find something that can get enough votes. And then it'll have to get attached to some kind of like appropriations bill or defense bill, one of these must pass bills, because Congress is not very good at passing things. And so they tend to stick stuff into these big bills that are must pass. So it's pretty likely that if permitting reform happens, it will get stuck into one of those big must pass bills, possibly at the end of this year. So we're keeping an eye on that. So it's just a question of if they can find a compromise that, as I mentioned, like it has enough stuff that can get enough votes and not enough stuff that people dislike to make them not vote for it. But I'd say the odds are reasonably good of it right now. It seems like there's enough people interested in it on both sides of the political aisle that it seems like there's a good chance that it could happen.
Good. Sounds like Joe Manchin might actually play a positive role in this one.
Yes, he's actually he's been doing a pretty good job. Other than his need for the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which the good/bad news is that passed in the debt ceiling deal. So like I personally was not a fan of that particular permitting. It basically kind of circumvented the permitting process and approved the project. So I thought that was kind of terrible, but it's done. So like the poison pill has been swallowed, and so I think that should make a deal more likely to happen this year. That's better. It doesn't have to worry about the Mountain Valley Pipeline gumming things up and poisoning the well. And Manchin is still working on it despite that being passed. So good for him trying to get something good done.
Good. Well, I just want to observe we've hit the 1 hour mark. Do you have a little more time? We got a few more questions.
Sure, I can hang around for a little bit.
Okay, let's see if we can get through those. I think Ravi was just providing some information for us. I don't see a question there. Unless that is a question, Ravi, let us know. Moving on to another one from Phil. In what way is the permitting and the transmission infrastructure itself different between dirty power plants and clean energy generation? Can you improve the green energy permitting and transmission without also improving the dirty energy permitting and transmission?
Yeah, in theory, you can. For example, if you say we're going to expedite the permitting process for projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, for example, we're just going to pass a bill that speeds up permitting of electrical transmission lines. In theory, you can do that. The problem is we have a split Congress, and Republicans are not so interested in doing things that just improve clean energy permitting. They want to expedite all energy permitting. And so in theory, you can do it that way. In reality, you can't do it that way because you can't get the votes, especially in the House of Representatives. You wouldn't even get a bill like that up for a vote in the House of Representatives, which is controlled by Republicans. So that's why we try to just do general permitting reform to make the general permitting happen more expediently. And as I mentioned, that will mostly benefit clean energy because that's what most of the demand is for. It will also expedite the permitting for certain like natural gas pipelines and things like that. But as long as we decrease the demand for natural gas and fossil fuels, then that becomes less of a problem.
Right, right. Again, going back to jobs and employment, we have heard that utilities cannot find enough people to hire. That is why things are so slow. Is it feasible to pass an electrician employment bill to create more jobs?
I would, yeah, I don't see why Congress in theory couldn't specifically like fund training programs for electricians. Problem there is that Congress doesn't like to spend money on stuff. They're generally trying to cut their spending and not increase their spending. So like in theory, I'm sure you could find a way to do that. I haven't seen any specific proposals to, for example, create specific training programs for electricians or anything like that. And I would think like, again, Republicans probably wouldn't care that much about training electricians because they're not so concerned about electrifying homes. It's more something more that Democrats tend to be more interested in. So again, it's something that would be difficult to get bipartisan support for. So in theory, yes. In reality, it's probably not realistic that it's going to happen.
Okay. Well, I think that's all of the questions. Lauren, do you think we should open it up to general discussion for if anybody else has a question or a comment even? There was a comment I'd like to read from Ravi. He identified or found a report that identifies several shovel-ready transmission projects across the U.S.
If I just make a quick comment. First off, thanks for your presentation, Dana. My company is advocating for many of the same things you are. I feel as if we paid you to do this presentation, so thank you.
I wish.
Yeah, my company initiated the SunZia transmission project.
Oh, nice.
That's the one that took 15 years to get through NEPA permitting, 2 NEPA bills, 2 NEPA processes. It should never take 15 years. And now even President Biden is using it as a poster child for why we need to reform permitting. So I'd love to talk with you separately because we're actively lobbying many of the same members you are, I'm sure. And I guess just to add on to the bipartisan issue, we're finding it challenging with many of the Republicans who are really dug in on the pipeline issue. And you have Graves from Louisiana, who's playing a very major role in permitting reform, and he's pretty dug in on that issue. So do you think that is something that will be a necessary give to get something done, to also bring in the fossil infrastructure into it?
Now, when you say natural gas pipelines, are you talking about like the Clean Water Act, the way that states tend to use the Clean Water Act to reject natural gas pipeline infrastructure?
Yes.
Yeah. So there is this section of the Clean Water Act, Section 401, that a few states have used to basically reject permits for gas pipelines, which they've tended to do for sort of climate air pollution reasons, whereas it's like the Clean Water Act. And so like Republicans are like, this is the Clean Water Act. You shouldn't be using the Clean Water Act to reject infrastructure for climate reasons, because that's not water, that's climate, which I think is a legitimate point to make, or legitimate perspective. So it's very possible that in a permitting reform package, Republicans will, demand, like, if you want transmission stuff, for example, then you will have to give us some changes to Section 401 of the Clean Water Act so that you can't use like climate and air pollution to reject gas pipelines for water reasons. So that's not something that Democrats like, because Democrats are like, we want to use every tool we have to stop fossil fuel infrastructure projects because we're in a climate crisis. That being said, we also had the I forget the name of it. The Supreme Court decision last year. Was it West Virginia versus EPA? or whichever one it was, that kind of lessened. No, it wasn't. Anyway, it basically lessened the reach or the scope of the Clean Water Act. So like wetlands, for example, are not really very well covered by the Clean Water Act anymore. It's got to be like navigable bodies of water or whatever. So that makes the Clean Water Act in general and Section 4, including Section 401, applicable to fewer projects, because now like a pipeline that's going to potentially impact a wetland, well, that's not included in the Clean Water Act anymore. So it kind of weakened that particular tool anyway. So like now that it's a weaker tool, I think it makes it less unpalatable for Democrats to include that in a compromise. So I think it's probably, if there is a permitting reform bipartisan deal, I think it's pretty likely that that concession will be in there. Like that'll be something that Democrats give to Republicans in exchange for Republicans giving Democrats something on like transmission or something like that. If that answers your question.
Got it. Yeah, that's helpful. I'll send you an email so we could talk separately as well.
Sure. Yeah, Tim.
Great. Glad you two connected. And Ravi, consider making a donation to CCL, you know.
We probably should.
Okay. Any last questions before we wrap it up? Oh, Laureen, you're muted.
I just want to say, Kent, I said this already, donate to Chasm and get your fancy Chasm t-shirt, please, for $100 or more. Please help us build the local organization that we need. And I'm glad to see so many people that are many names that are new to me. So please sign up with the Climate Action Santa Monica website. Just go to climateactionsantamonica.org. We would love to stay in touch with you on local initiatives. So,
And can I just say,
CCL, yes.
sorry, Lauren, I just wanted to thank you for inviting CCL to do this. I also see a lot of names that I don't know, so it's great that we've had this opportunity to have this conversation.
Indeed.
And if anybody's interested in getting more information on CCL, you can reach out to me through Laureen. Laureen has my contact information.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you again, Dana. This has been so informative. I really appreciate your time and explaining all this in so much detail.
Yeah, thank you so much.
No problem. Happy to do it. And Sackett was that, I'm pretty sure was that Supreme Court case that was bothering me. I couldn't remember the name of it.
Well, Laureen, we can stop the recording and please grab the chat if you're able to download that just in case